The Bush School, how the One teaches created and has been recreated in Australian writing. From Binalong to Bulbybrush, prepared and presented by Hank Nelson.
When asked what they were taught, pupils of the Bush schools from the 1920s to the 1950s talk about the poetry and stories of Patterson and Lawson. The distinctive knowledge that they hold in common is the loaded dog, the man from Ironbark, the drover's wife, Clancy, Harry Dale, Saltbush Bill, and that there dog of mine. Some pupils heard the rhythms, images and values of the bush ballads in every one of the 6, 7 or even 8 years they were at school. Australians sitting at school desks might see in their imaginations Drake on the Golden Hind, Clive of India and Gordon at Khartoum, but they knew and could be Andy, our Andy, the one who went with cattle.
Our Andy's gone with cattle now. Our hearts are out of order. With drought he's gone to battle now, across the Queensland border. Ah, who shall cheek the squatter now, when he comes round us snarling?
Writing, pupils saw, could come from what they saw around them, and it changed how they looked at people and place. In the 1870s, Patterson had a little of his formal education in the Binalong school near Yass, and Lawson had nearly all his classroom education at Urundari between Mudgee and Golgong. In a fragment of autobiography, Lawson described the school that he went to for about 3 years.
Father and a few others petitioned for a provisional school at It was Urundari now. The black name had been restored. It was of bark. I remembered the dimensions for a long time, but I've forgotten them now. Anyway, it was a mere hut. The selector, an Irishman named John Tierney, was selected as schoolmaster. He'd served in some capacity in the army in Africa, a paymaster or something. His strong points were penmanship, arithmetic, geography, and the brogue. His weak ones were spelling, grammar and singing. He was a feet something and very gaunt. He spent some months training in the public school in Mudgee and had a skillion built onto the school where he camped. Among the scholars was a black goanna. On summer days he'd lay along a beam over the girls' seats and improve his mind a little and doze a lot. The drone of the school seemed good for his nerves. Sometimes, when the master's back was turned for a minute or so, one of the boys would cry suddenly, "Girls, the goanna's fallen!" And then you'd hear the girls squawk.
Les Murray did correspondence lessons at home till at 9 he began walking the 4 miles to Bulbybrush School. He went across the ridges, then north along Bunya Creek.
Close in around the school were the first pine trees I ever saw, and I still associate the smell of pines with Bulbybrush School. And we also had silky oak trees, which I've always loved ever since. And there's a dam in the little gully we used to jump across on the way to school too. The last thing you did before you walked up the slope to the school was to jump over this gully, and you could every morning it was hard to do. You could only just get there. But it was a matter of pride. You didn't walk around. You jumped over this water. We had an air raid trench. Provided for us by, I suppose, the army or somebody during the Second World War, in case the Japanese Air Force came over the hills and decided to take out this strategically important school. I think there were about 6 kids could sit at a desk, and they had 3 inkwells, if I remember rightly. So 2 people dipped into a common inkwell. They always, when you started mucking around, sooner or later the ink ended up down the front of your trousers. I mean, every time it landed in the same place, soaked down the front of your trousers. Up the front there was the teacher's table. There was a small library. It was a 3x3, I think, bookshelf, and which I devoured. I still remember the books out of it too. I remember there was Mawson's Journal of his travels in the Antarctic, a great big tome, and I fell upon it. And the teacher, knowing I was only 9 years old, said, "Oh, that book would be too advanced for you." And I said, "Oh, can I borrow it anyway, sir?" I knew it wasn't, because I'd been reading since I was 4. You know, I'd been devouring everything I could get my hands on. I read Stanley Gibbons' stamp catalogue for the lack of something better. And I devoured this. I thought it was wonderful. I still remember chunks of it.
Eventually, the farms along Bunya Creek changed, from selling cream to selling milk and then to beef. The most obvious sign of those changes has been in the colour of the cattle grazing the slopes. The tawny yellow jerseys gave way to black and white Friesians, and now they have been replaced by the white-faced, red-coated Herefords. In 1930, Bulbybrush School had been 40 tired children crowded into an 18 by 25-foot room. Even in 1948, many of Les Murray's schoolmates would have arrived at school after helping out on the farm.
All that stuff in Miles Franklin is true. You know, I've seen kids go to sleep at 11 o'clock with their heads down on the desk because they'd got up at 4 o'clock and milked cows before they got there. Most of us did some work before we left. I didn't do as much as some people. My parents were a bit indulgent that way, but some of the kids were exhausted, and they were facing another 4 hours work when they went home too. But the 16-hour day is a well-known institution in the bush. And my father, like all of his generation, the day he left school he was ploughing, you know. The day after he left school he was ploughing. He was 14, and he actually forgot how to read. He left school when he was 14, which was the minimum legal leaving age, and he got married when he was 28, and he picked up the paper and he found he'd forgotten how to read. It took him a couple of days to get it back. It gave him a great jolt, that did, because he'd been working so hard all those years since, you know. His culture was music and dancing and damned hard work and lots of it. And no printed matter anyway. It was purely oral and musical culture, you know.
The school closed at the end of 1971. All that remains now are the concrete steps and the slight depressions where the wartime trench and the pits for the toilets were dug. The toilets were shifted each time the pits filled and moved steadily north, the boys and girls' dunnies in stately two-step. It took nearly a generation to fill a pit, so the toilets, Les says, made only 3 stages on their progress towards Queensland. Hal Porter, short of money and his first novel unfinished, went back to teaching in 1938. He was appointed to a one-teacher school in the Strzelecki Ranges of South Gippsland. Nearly 30 years later, in the paper chase, he his memories of the farmers with whom he boarded.
Trethewey is about 45. His hair is long and as black as the miniature pom-poms in his ear holes. A leftover habit of his tomcatting days is the lavish use of Californian poppy hair oil. Since, as one of Mrs. Trethewey's slatternly domestic practices, a side of bacon hangs over the enamel wash basin in the bathroom at the end of the back veranda, and since he leans his head on the bacon while washing his hands, I do not eat bacon. Mrs. Trethewey is a little younger than he, and is the smudged copy of a fine-looking woman. She, no less than her husband, is to blame for the all-round dilapidation. The front-room hearth is filled to the hobs with soot. Fluff shifts about under the chairs. Behind curtains of decomposing lace, the unopenable windows are green-paned from a sort of algae. The room is tiled from ceiling to dado with photographs of the dead, unwinking, unsmiling, and linked to each other by cobwebs.
There was a time, I remember, in the 50s when half of Australian literature seemed to consist of sensitive novels written about and by lonely school teachers suffering the barbarism of the bush, you know. Waking Frights were probably one of the most famous examples. The best examples are written by Hal Porter. Some of that beautiful overdone prose of Hal's. And it was a great theme, and it seems to have vanished now, as one-teacher schools go away. A lot of it would have been the fact that they didn't know, and the people they were staying with didn't know, that they belonged to different cultures. They couldn't put it into those words, you know. They tended to be sent from the city, and they belonged to something like the official culture of Australia. And the official culture of Australia didn't exist in the small farming bush. You know, we had another culture of our own, which if we were Aborigines would now be recognised. But it sounds more resentful than it is. In fact, in those, we were all as despised as Dad and Dave and all that, you know. So the Aborigines were then despised. They've now got lucky and got recognised. But it was an utterly different culture. It was working people's hard-working country. It was based on music and storytelling. It was thoroughly oral and heroic and very ancient. Went back to the peasantry of Europe, you know, and had nothing to do with city culture at all. And if the teacher couldn't step across that, as some did, if the teacher couldn't understand how to step across that, then they were isolated, poor souls. And so a lot of them, these books are full of hatred of a culture that they can neither comprehend nor see is there. But this young teacher was appointed to a school away out in the bush, and he went to stay with a family where the husband was old and the wife was young, and hormones began to interact between him and the young wife, and he went off to for his Christmas holidays, and the people in the district who'd noticed what was going on, they said, "Look, old Jim, he knows about this." He said, he's been keeping quiet, but he knows. You better not come back. Or at least if you come back, don't for God's sake go back to the farm, because he'll kill you." And oh no, I've got to do the right thing. So he went off for his holidays and came back, and they warned him again, you know, don't go out to the farm. He went out to the farm, and nothing more was heard of him. And the children went to school the first day, and no teacher arrived, and they all finally trooped off home, and their parents got alarmed and began to make inquiries, and the cops were called in, and the old man out at the farm, his wife had vanished, and he said, "Oh, I don't know, he come out here," and they went off together, her and him. He said, "I told them get off the place." That's the last I saw of them. And they couldn't shake him in this story, and they did the usual thing. They tramped all over the evidence, you know, hundreds of people looking where one black tracker would have been much better. And all they found was a horse, the teacher's horse, up on a hillside with a bullet hole in its forehead, quite dead. And by this time a few days had passed, and the horse was in a bad state of decay. And being country people, they didn't like decayed meat and stuff. They kept away from this and went on looking. They found nothing. And years later, the old fellow was finally dying, and some of them were in the hospital, and he said, "You're a squeamish lot of bastards." He said, "You should have dug under that horse." He said, "I knew you wouldn't." And they went out and found where it had been, and dug under it. They found 2 bodies, each one fitted with an extra hole in the head. I used that in a poem. Sergeant Forby lectures the cadets. Old Warwick, the husband, scratched his head. They'd run off together was all he knew. He didn't know where. Most would have said where. He had no theories about the horse. We stood around it, the trackers drowsing. Our witnesses reckon they told the boarder you knew and would shoot him. He had no views on that. They went off together. I told them get her and him. Then some fool poked the horse with a stick. It bowled us gagging clean off the hill. Country people aren't keen on decay. Too many midsummer funerals, I guess, of beasts and men. Too many feeds of ptomaine mutton in the heat. Sweets from the handy home botulant kit. No market for jugged hare or ripe cheese among that sort. We had some sort of case, opportunity, motive, shot horse, but Warwick's counsel made mince of it. Without bodies, the onus was on us. I hope the onus comes on him some dark night. But he was right, and Warwick got off. He was 10 minutes gone when the answer hit me like a brick. Country people aren't keen on decay, of course. And we dug under the horse. The secret of our profession, this, we dig under the horse. Dismissed.
Les Murray went from Bulbybrush Public to country high schools and Sydney University. Cliff Green went from Melbourne and Toorak Teachers College to bush schools. Cliff Green is now one of Australia's most successful writers of film scripts and children's books. At the end of his year-long teacher's training course in 1959, he applied to go to the Mallee. He went, he says, as a romantic, self-taught on the legend of the bush. The reality changed, without destroying, his romanticism. After 2 years at a school in the sand and limestone of the Mallee, he went to Welton, northwest of Echuca, a school of yellow weatherboard sitting among Murray River gums.
Well, we had a series of tragedies in that each year a family of children that I taught lost a parent through tragic circumstances. It was uncanny. And when I say tragic, I don't just mean accidents. There was a suicide under extraordinarily sad circumstances. There was a mother who had a brain tumour that caused her in the last 3 weeks of her life to completely change character. And her little children had this appallingly bewildering, traumatic experience of their mother behaving absolutely out of court. There was a father who a young father who died of a heart attack on the tennis court in front of his children. These sort of tragedies sear a community. And I always closed the school and went to the funeral. And the school participated in the mourning process with those children, with those families, and then in the rehabilitation process. It was a very important element in their lives. But it's very interesting to see a community, a family and a community in a school go through a mourning process and sort of emerge from it with something stronger. You know, they were capable children. They were the children of capable parents, and they were capable. They could do everything. I remember one little boy started that school. He was a little farming kid, and he'd not been to kinder or done anything. He was just 5. But he was a little smart-ass, little tough little kid. Remember, I was out the back chopping wood. Now, I'm not physically adept most of the time, and I didn't try to hide. I never try to hide that. If I go into one of these communities, I'm a dead mug. And what I find is you get all the help in the world you need, providing you've got something else going, providing you can give them something as well as they give something to you. Anyway, here I was chopping wood, right, and I got because we had 2 fires to keep going, and I got the axe jammed in the log, and I turned it over and I was thumping it on the back. And this little voice came out from way across the other side of the school ground. "For Christ's sake, Mr. Green, you don't chop wood like that. You'll bust the bloody handle." Well, my teaching fed into my writing, and it led in a direct sense to me becoming a writer. I was always intending to become a writer, and I've been working at it on and off. But 2 things happened in my first school. One was that I, through sheer desperation, wrote a play for the children I taught because I couldn't find anything worth using, and ultimately that was produced on television, so I was on the track there. And the other thing was that these new experiences were so overwhelming for me and so enjoyable that I began to write them down and get them published in the Teachers Union Journal in Melbourne. And then I began to write, I was invited to write radio and television programs for schools because I had some television experience, so that was a direct feed. And then when I left teaching, one writes about, I suppose, those 20 years between the ages of 20 and 40, or 10 years with me, constantly for the rest of one's life in different ways. And I wrote a little television series based on a teacher. And the children's books I write, which are set on the Murray, which sort of are a fantasy of that locality or that environment set back in the 1890s, continue to be with me, and I continue to write them. So those 9 years were seminal in every respect for me.
That was Cliff Green. Les Murray's father, Cecil, went to school at Sawyers Creek, just to the east of Bulbybrush. He started when he was 4. They needed him to make up the numbers. And he spent a lot of time building pigsties out of matchsticks. Later, Sawyers Creek School became a place of terror. A flogger was appointed as teacher.
I'm sure there were never many of these in the bush, but this fellow was. He used to go into the rainforest and cut 6-foot canes and leave the knots and knobs on them, you know. And he used to flog with both hands down across the children's backs as if he were not so much flogging the kids as trying to cut them in half. And he used to sort of catch his tongue between his teeth and chew on his tongue as he did it. He apparently later was... I've checked up with Dad. Apparently the fellow was hospitalised later. He went right off his head. He used to flog the children unmercifully. His idea of teaching reading was to get them to open up the old school magazine, which they used to use for teaching. I think they still do. It's a good magazine. And a child would start to read, and as soon as it made a mistake, girl or boy, it made no difference to him, slash, get a cut of this 6-foot cane down the back. And of course they'd scream and start crying, and they couldn't see the words through the tears. Some of them couldn't even start reading because they were so terrified. And of course they'd get it without reading a word. And he also used to use short, hard little canes as well that bruised. You know, my father couldn't milk cows for a couple of weeks from his almost smashed hands. one day was flogging Dad's best mate, a fellow called Bob Toms, and Dad could stand no more of it. He was only 9 years old. And stood up and he said, "Hey," he said, "that's not a bloody bullock you're flogging." And the teacher sort of said, "Mind your business, you know." And Dad said, "It's about time somebody took a pull, you know, chipped you." And of course the school all expected Dad would begin and now cut to pieces. He wouldn't survive. And in fact the bloke backed down. He realised he'd gone too far, went back out to his table, put the cane away, and all the canes disappeared. And then, of course, the world fell in on him because all the kids had been trying to tell their parents. Finally, they boiled over, started screaming at their parents to come and talk to this bloke, you know, that's what's been going on. The parents started to believe them. And the first fella up there the next morning was Bob Tom's father, old Bob. And he threatened to blow this bloke's head off and stuff him up a hollow log and burn it. And, of course, the teacher just burst into tears, you know. It turned out he was... I guess he was so strung up and hysterical anyway, being well on the way to being crazy, that anything could bring him down at this stage. So every parent that came along, he burst into fresh tears. There was no more teaching. Then the inspector descended, and then the sack descended. But he was an aberration. I mean, most of them weren't like that at all. Most country teachers, they were good people. The road comes on through Sawyer's Creek, where the high whaleback ridge becomes a peak, and where my father, aged 9 years, faced down the bashing teacher, a squeers who cut 6-foot canes in the scrub and, chewing his tongue in a subjective ecstasy, lashed back-arching children. "Mind your business!" Time someone chipped you. Short blazed at tall, and the knobbed cane withdrew. My father was cheered shoulder high in the playground then, and the bunched rods vanished. But previously slack parents loomed, shouting, and after them the sack. This is part of a set of poems I've written one each month of the year for 13 months, because it takes 13 such poems to get the whole cycle of the year in. And set at Bunya. This is the January poem. And I should mention in advance that the nearest pub is 11 miles away, a place called Cranback, and there's a windy road between here and there. And somehow all these years people have been driving home drunk. Very drunk, and touch wood, none of them have been killed yet. Although they often run off the road. Variations on a measure of Burns. When January is home to visit her folks and official work is a public hoax, soy sprouts dotting the serpentine strokes, ploughs combed in the lacquered hill soil that each afternoon's rainstorm soaks, weave a green jacquard. And zucchini and wart squash and Queensland blues, not the dog but the pumpkin, squeak together like shoes in tractor trailers and nectarines bruised from being awaited. But the grizzled haze over mountain views looks faintly methylated. Because Drought, who's in on every forced sale, though he might have seen the farmers granted bail this summer, has the continent in his entail. Even Smashy's seen you. That old man up a back road fumbling his mail gets letters from El Nino. Disappointment, holiday and heatwave shilly-shally round this snaky time of year. Stock prices plunge and rally. But the government's recruited for keeps from this summer. The flashed brick erstwhile Whitlam toilet lock lacks its school and stands orphaned on its gully. The PO's a closed file. We retain a public phone and some dirt main roads on whose corners part-time squatters tip sprawling loads of gravel for drunk drivers who for lifetimes and by codes like wall car and hug the crown miraculously get home to treat their families like toads or finish upside down in the dark, miles from town. Standing on my scalp with the rain sparks falling upward, windscreen a collective noun. Delighted by the spinning tyre slowing above the cupboard and the glare path through inverted trees. Myself as I could have been through brutal labour for a bare livelihood. Myself on that quest few families dare acknowledge, let alone go with you on, the hunger for the rest.
In this program, From Binalong to Bulbybrush in the Bush School series, you heard the voices of Les Murray and Cliff Green. Readings from Henry Lawson's A Fragment of Autobiography and Hal Porter's The Paper Chase were by Bill Conn. The program was edited by Bronwyn Hughes and prepared and presented by Dr. Hank Nelson, Senior Fellow in the Department of Pacific and Southeast Asian History at the Australian National University.